So we've completed the majority of work that was expected as part of the PDD for this process. But at the moment, our process is very simple. So in order to demonstrate how a business exception might be derived and thrown, we're going to make a small change to our process to include a business exception. This business exception is going to be based on the date of the work item in the Acme application. So, for example, we have a date here. If the date is before 2019, we're going to reject the case and we're going to throw it as a business exception. One problem we have at the moment is that we haven't loaded this information to our queue, so we don't have this date to make that decision on. So before we get started, we're going to make a small change to our data load process to include the date when we load the data to the queue. To do this, open up the data load XML file, and where we have the for each in the queue item, we can update the collection, add a new field. Let's call it WI date, because date is a known phrase in .NET and may cause some problems. And then we'll select the date from the data table and add it to our table. So when UiPath grabs the information from the queue, it can immediately use that date to make a decision about whether it should process the case or not. Make sure we're on our work items page, and let's run the data load. So we can easily access this information because when the process is called, the transaction item is passed into the process layer, and all of the information that is associated with it in the queue is automatically passed through. Let's open up our process. And before we even navigate to a workflow, we're going to put a business decision in. Now, this is a very simple process at the moment. Typically, when we have a process, there will be certain paths that are taken, and as a result, we'll use a flowchart activity. Drag the flowchart activity onto your main panel, expand it, and start to drag all of the items below into that flowchart. Be careful, sometimes when the items are dragged, that they reverse the order. Attach each branch to the next. And prior to the first navigate, we're going to add our business rule. Let's make a little bit more space for it. Sometimes you might find it easier to use the arrow keys to move the sequences rather than dragging them around with the mouse. Rather than using an if statement, we're going to use a flow decision. So before we're able to make a decision on the date, what we're going to need is another component which is going to convert that string date into a date that we're able to manipulate. Let's quickly start to create that new component. Place it in the generic folder and call it generic convert string date to date. This is a very common function that you're going to need, so doing this once and making it generic is going to be really useful for you. Back in the project folder, press refresh and open your convert string date to date. Let's update the usual properties. And check the arguments coming in. So of course, this time we're going to be passing in a string date. So argument 1 is going to be in str date. And the example that we're going to be working with is in the format of 2019-04-01. The out argument is going to be a date version of the same date. So out dt date, and we won't have a file path. This time, the out dt date argument is going to be a type date. That's system.date, system.datetime. And because of the checks will perform as we're converting the date, we don't really need to check value on its way out. Okay, so to convert a date, we can use an assign. First thing we need to do is check that the date that's been provided can actually be converted into a date. So using if statement, we say try parse exact, so datetime dot try parse exact, open brackets, enter our string date, which is in str_date. The format we know is going to be year dash month dash day. Next we need to tell .NET what culture to use. So in this case we're using the US date format. So we're going to say system.globalization.cultureinfo.current culture, which will pick up our existing culture from the US machine. And for the style, we don't need any particular style, so we can use system.globalization.datetime_styles.none. And then finally, we're going to create a new variable, even though there's a little bug in the software where this doesn't work. So we will call it dt new date, and we'll go and create that new date. Make sure that it's a type date, type of date time, and hopefully your error message disappears. So what we're doing here is we're saying of the date that's been passed in, the 2018-2019-0401, in America, does this make sense as a date in the format year, month, date? We're going to try that. If .NET is able to pass that as a date, what we then need to do is actually pass it as a date. So we will use an assign. And the syntax for this is very similar to what we've just used, with a slight difference. And we will assign this to that dt new date variable that we created previously, which doesn't work. And we just need to remove the dt new date variable at the end. Also, we're not using try parse exact. We're actually going to use parse exact. So the try simply says, are we able to do this? The parse exact says, actually, go ahead and do it. And if it's not possible to pass that date, then we're going to throw an exception. And we're going to say that the date wasn't able to be passed. New exception. Date provided could not be passed as a date. Cool. And so we can very easily test this function now. We already have a default date. Let's run it quickly. We didn't get an error message, which implies that it was all passed successfully. If we change the date to an invalid date, so for example, month 21, we get an error message saying the date could not be passed as a date. And we know that our check to see if the date is a valid date is working successfully. The last thing we need to do in this component is make sure we're assigning the out dt date argument the value of the dt new date. We could do this directly, but in this case we'll just use an assign. Out dt date is equal to the dt new date. Next up, we'll add this back into our process and build the business rule to check whether that date is before or after a certain time. So now we have our new component, which is going to convert a date for us. We can add this into the process and make a decision to see whether the date of the work item that we're looking at is indeed prior to 2019, in which case we're going to throw a business exception. So let's invoke the component initially. Make a little bit more space using the down arrows. Add a flow decision. If the criteria is true, we're going to continue. Therefore, we need to make sure that the decision we're making gives us a value of true if the year is 2019 or above. Else, if it's false, what we're going to do is we're going to just create a small sequence, add a log message so that we know what's happened. If the decision is false, we're simply going to throw a business rule exception. we click on the flow decision, rather than saying true, we'll say that we're looking at 2019 or later. If it's false, then we are before 2019. In our exception message, we're going to create a new business rule exception, and the date provided was prior to 2019. Okay, let's just set the arguments for our workflow that we're invoking. So select generic convert string date to date, import the arguments, and this time we're not going to be passing in a hard-coded date, obviously. We're going to reference just give you a little second to think about what we're going to reference, but it's going to be the transaction, the in transaction item, dot specific content, and the date field. We are going to make it to string because at this point we want it a string before we pass it into that component. And when the date comes back out, we're going to have a new variable of dt work item date. Double check the variable type. It's been set as date time, and its error message has disappeared. I've just noticed that we do have an error message in the top right hand corner. Now this error message is because we haven't actually set a condition in our flow decision activity. So let's click on it, check the condition, and let's check the rule. Something we can do here is with our new date, dt work item date, we can say dt.year is greater than or equal to 2019. Because year is a type of integer, we're able to perform a mathematical function on it. So in the previous video, we uploaded the data. So we have work items ready waiting for us. We just need to run the main process and have a look at the output of some of those cases where we've now built in our business rule. What we saw was the robot continually trying to log in, which indicated that there was an error. If we look at the output pane, we can see that the given key was not present in the dictionary. So where we're invoking our process, we can see that we were trying to reference a field called date. But in fact, we called this WI date. So let's update that, and that should make things better. However, one problem is that we may have some older items in our queue, because when we initially created the queue, there was only one field, which was WID. Now we've got some items which have two fields, the WID and the date, but some of the older items, which may or may not have been processed, would fail if they don't have the date as part of their transaction item. So the easiest thing to do here is quickly go and delete the queue and start again. This is generally why it's not a great idea to have data items in your queues with different data in the specific content field. Delete it and re-add the queue. Remember, we had no retries. And of course, we now need to go and run our data load again. So navigate back to the work items page. And rerun our data load process. So if we quickly check our transaction items now, we should see that they have both the WID and the WI date, which means we can finally run our main process again and find out what the result of our business exception addition is to our process. So that's 2019, it's been processed, great. Here's 2019, it's being processed. Let's have a quick look in Orchestrator and have a look at the status of our transactions. We can see that some were successful if they were processed in 2019, and if their date was prior to 2019, they were marked as business exceptions and the reason was provided.